I'm Oliver North. This is War Stories, coming to you from Berlin, Germany. This U.S. Army guardhouse, preserved here in the Allied Museum, once stood just a few miles away at Checkpoint Charlie, the famous crossing point between free West Berlin and the communist East. Berlin was, for 45 years, literally on the front lines of the Cold War. American, British, and French soldiers faced the enemy directly across the barrier. Berlin crawled with spies, intrigue, and espionage. And in 1961, when the communists built a wall dividing the city, it tore families apart and created an isolated island of freedom deep inside the Soviet bloc. This is the story of Outpost Berlin. It's the riveting history of America and her allies in Cold War Berlin. Our standoff with the communists behind the Iron Curtain. As the spy wars heated up in the shadows, on the streets of Berlin, a daily flood of East Germans were voting with their feet. By 1961, over 2.6 million Germans had fled communism to freedom through Berlin.
You need to understand that before the Berlin Wall went up, inside the city of Berlin was an open city.
Pennsylvania native Vern Pike joined the Army in 1958. A year later, when he arrived in West Berlin as a platoon leader of the 287th MP Company, the city was filled with refugees.
Thousands and thousands of refugees a month would come into West Berlin freely. They'd go on the S-Bahn or the U-Bahn, or they'd walk across.
This was enormously damaging to the economic life of East Germany.
The refugee camps in West Berlin were overflowing. It was an incredible situation.
By July 1961, the crisis reached a breaking point. Khrushchev called Berlin the most dangerous place in the world. Desperate to halt the exodus, Walter Ulbricht convinced the Soviet premier of the unthinkable, sealing off West Berlin with a wall.
The idea of cutting a city in half seemed impossible.
If Ulbricht didn't do something, he would have no one left.
Khrushchev?
And the signal was given to encircle Berlin and put a wall right through its center.
I was the military police duty officer that evening, August 12th. And around 2 o'clock in the morning of the 13th, we noticed that, specifically at Friedrichstrasse, that there were some German workers that were digging holes in the street and putting concrete posts in them and connecting them with barbed wire.
The next morning, you had barbed wire rolling all through the city.
Over the radio, the East German government announced that everything was secured.
The communist authorities lied to their people, claiming they were building, quote, an anti-fascist wall of protection. But the East Germans knew the truth. This last escape door to freedom was closing fast.
People began to use buildings to jump over the wall, to drop down on the western side.
The firemen from West Berlin would have the safety net and they would catch them. So what the communists started doing was evacuating the people from those buildings and sealing them with cinder blocks in the windows.
People were desperate to use this seemingly fleeting opportunity to get out.
Including the border guards themselves. This guard, Konrad Schumann, was filmed as he fled to freedom, the first of 2,156 guards who would eventually use their position to escape.
Imagine a father not being able to get through to the other side, to his own family, or kids who had visited relatives. Yes, the city was in shock.
As the communists fortify the wall, tensions escalate when Vern Pike and his fellow soldiers confront Soviet tanks in a standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. By the fall of '61, the city of Berlin was completely divided by miles of barbed wire and tons of concrete. West Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt despised the ugly barrier.
A crime tied to the spiritual bankruptcy of communism that sees it forced to erect granite walls to prevent its workman's paradise from being almost completely depopulated.
Back in the States, David Murphy was called to CIA headquarters by Director Allen Dulles. They immediately went to see the president.
We went down into the West Wing, I was introduced to Kennedy as the station chief of Berlin, who just returned. And so the first thing Kennedy did was get up from his rocker, shake my hand, and say, "I would like to make one thing clear. There is nothing we can do about East Berlin. Our writ does not run there."
President Kennedy decided a wall was better than a war.
The Russians were not at all involved in actually building the wall. This was entirely an East German enterprise, and they were very, very proud of it.
The East Germans may have built the wall, but it was Moscow that imposed strict new regulations on the few remaining crossings between East and West. By October, one of those checkpoints was fast becoming a Cold War flashpoint. Philadelphia's own Vern Pike was right in the middle.
We had a highway route that brought us from West Germany into West Berlin. And we ran checkpoints Alpha and Bravo at both ends of the Autobahn. So when the Berlin Wall went up and we were going to establish a checkpoint operation, quite naturally, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie.
Checkpoint Charlie becomes the gateway, if you will, through the wall.
It is the crossing point between the western part of Berlin and the Soviet sector. Shortly thereafter, maybe one of the shrewdest political decisions President Kennedy ever made, he sent General Lucius Clay back to Berlin.
Now retired, the hero of the Berlin airlift returned to the city he'd saved 12 years earlier.
When he came to Germany, he began to develop a completely different picture.
Clay felt it was very important to expose the reality that it was Soviet power that was responsible for the wall.
That's what started the crisis. We immediately began the probes.
Clay began to send people through the new wall
To show that we will exercise our access rights into the East. We had an MP Jeep in front and 2 MP Jeeps behind. And their mission, you go through the barricades at all cost.
A group of U.S. soldiers are stopped by the Reds at a checkpoint that is now the only entrance to the Soviet sector.
Very quickly, you had Soviet tanks on the eastern side facing American tanks on the western side.
The most potentially explosive tinderbox since Russia began the Cold War.
They had painted over the tanks, so we didn't know whether they were East German or Russian.
General Lucius Clay told Pike's commander to find out.
I said, Vern, you go over there and determine whether they're Soviet or East German tanks.
The young lieutenant walked directly through Checkpoint Charlie to an unoccupied Soviet-built T-54 tank.
So I climbed up in the tank, went down inside, right in the driver's compartment. The driver was kind enough to leave a Red Army newspaper by his brake handle.
Pike held in his hands proof that these tanks were manned by the Soviet Army. He grabbed the newspaper and raced back into West Berlin.
I said, sir, here's the newspaper that I said, tell General Clay what you did. So he gave me the phone, and I told General Clay, I said, sir, they're Soviet tanks.
Clay had accomplished his purpose. This is not an East German measure. This is a Soviet measure to try to prevent people from fleeing to freedom.
After our tank incident is when they really began to barricade the Friedrichstrasse area. And then by February of '62, they had completed the solid concrete wall itself.
There was a wall facing the western side, but there was also a wall facing the eastern side. And in between those two walls, you had the death strip.
From the west, this is what the Berlin Wall looked like. On the other side, the death strip, a no man's land between 2 rows of concrete barriers that divided Berlin. Fortified with miles of barbed wire, self-firing 85mm guns, and patrolled by attack dogs, the communists designed this area as a killing zone. From watchtowers like these, German border guards armed with machine guns tried to keep the population captive. But even all this couldn't keep them from fleeing to freedom. At least 254 East Germans died trying to escape, but the final toll may never be known. After 2 years of living in their divided city, Mauerkrankheit, or wall sickness, set in. Many Berliners felt uneasy and despondent.
With regard to the Allies and especially to the United States. Were they really going to help? They felt being left out.
But all that would change in June '63 with the arrival of the American president. What effect does that have on the population?
When Kennedy arrives in Berlin, people suddenly gain hope again. People gathered at the streets, in the places where his car went through.
On 26 June 1963, John F. Kennedy spoke to the people of West Berlin.
When you look on the place in front of the Schöneberg Rathaus, it was absolutely packed.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in.
Hundreds of thousands gathered to hear the speech.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
What it meant was that the hearts and minds of America were intertwined with Berlin, and that we would not abandon them.